season. Well, we hope it's the final doubleheader of the season. Results for the third time in the opponent winning both of the 7-inning games. I'm at Gajtka. Mike Asti's alongside. This is Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live, coming at you on a Friday night. Only time we could really find some time to talk about the Pirates during this 5-game set. Yes, a 5-game set against the St. Louis Cardinals at PNC Park. Cards win 6-5 in game one, and then in the nightcap 7-2, a comeback victory in a very sloppy and somewhat controversial bottom of the 6th inning. That's right, bottom of the 6th inning, as the Cardinals were technically the home team in game two. So some weirdness here as St. Louis improves to 24-24. They're right there in the wild card race. The Pirates, a much uglier record, 15-36, a season low, 21 games under 500. All the good feelings from the Stephen Brault complete game. Yes, a Stephen Brault complete game. Reiterating a lot tonight in the opener. That's all vaporized as now they've lost 10 out of their last 11 and are at least a couple of games clear of the Texas Rangers for worst record in Major League Baseball. So they have that going for them, which is nice. Mike, it was looking like maybe a tidy split in this doubleheader after a very prolonged game one, even though it was just 7 innings. But that one had some back and forth to it, and the Cardinals ended up converting a 6-2 lead into that 6-5 win, just barely. But like I said, it got sloppy. It got, downright unwatchable at times in the bottom of the 6th in game two. Another microcosm of the season right there. 3 fielding errors, including a rare catcher's interference against Jacob Stallings. Also, probably a very bad call from the home plate umpire as well that led to an important walk that opened the floodgates for what ended up being a 6-run Cardinals outburst there. So the Cards playing for a lot, the Pirates not playing for much, and I suppose it looked like it there at the end of game two.
Yeah, in typical Pittsburgh Pirate fashion, they play entertaining games, but entertaining games for asinine reasons. So these were asinine games for the Pirates. There, had to get my term in.
You did it.
They get swept in the doubleheader, and again, it doesn't mean anything for the Pirates. In fact, as we've talked about in recent shows, it's better off for them to be losing. The Cardinals are playing for something, but for respectability purposes, this is a young team. This is a team that wants to prove themselves a little bit for the future, you would hope, certainly with most of these players being young and many of them still playing to be part of the future of this team, that they would win a second game of doubleheader when they had a lead late in that game and after a starter would go deep into that game, but not the case as the Cardinals blow it wide open and then end up blowing out the Pittsburgh Pirates. The odd part is, as much as you maybe look at game two of this doubleheader and say the Pirates should have hung on and won game two because Chad Gould goes through 5 and pitches admirably to that point, and the Pirates had a lead going into the 6th inning, and it's 6 out of 7, remember, in this 2020 doubleheader situation. But really, you look to game one, the Cardinals put up 4 errors and won the game. I mean, that's not common for any level of baseball in terms of contender or not. If you put up 4 errors, it's the same thing in football. You throw 4 interceptions, you lay the football on the ground and fumble it 4 times, you're figuring to lose that game. Anybody should be able to beat you if your opponent, you're all professionals out there, you're all getting paid. If the opponent helps you out with some gift baskets that often. The Cardinals had a comedy of errors out there with 4 errors. The Pirates, of course, won themselves, as that's been the accustomed thing in these games. They have to at least get one. But their errors, while they hurt them, they didn't end up killing them enough, and they were able to win that game. In fact, winning game one, in which Brian Hayes had a big one, 2 for 3, a run scored. He was performing in game one, not so much in game two. So it almost appears game one is maybe the game that got away from this team out of these 2 games, even though they do end up losing both. But of course, it's not meaningful for Pittsburgh. It is meaningful for the Cardinals, especially in comparison to the Cincinnati Reds, who we talked about in the last post-game show, and their competition for playoff jockeying. But the Pirates, it's another one of those Friday night doubleheaders, 7 innings, and we'll get to this later, but at least in a season in which this team is nowhere near contention, it's been as asinine as ever before, that I think both you and I would agree. And I would imagine everybody out there, this might be one of the few things in the world that everybody seemingly is going to agree on, that 7 innings for these doubleheaders in the year 2020 with a global pandemic and this Pirate team being as bad and crazy as they are, it's best for business and it's best for this team that I have to go through 9 for back-to-back.
Well, exactly. And I will say this about the Pirates, even though it may feel like for a lot of fans, especially, they just want to play out the string, get this thing over with, and just 9 games to go, by the way, if you are.
It'd be understandable, honestly.
If you are counting down. But I don't think they're numb to the disappointment and the frustration. And it was a frustrating day at the ballpark, a long day at the ballpark, and one that took an emotional toll on Jacob Stallings at the very least, because he gets called for the catcher's interference in that decisive 6th inning in game 2. And he also feels like that his guy, Chad Kuhl, got screwed on that 3-2 pitch, right. Bottom of the zone, breaking ball, definitely crossed the strike zone, and it should have been a strikeout, should have been rung up. But instead, the inning starts with a walk, and we all know that when you get that leadoff runner on, that leadoff batter on, regardless of how it happens, I know you always hear a walk's worse than a single. Believe it or not true, mathematically speaking. Just getting the leadoff runner on, though, changes the math a lot. You're about 50-50 to score at least 1 run there at that point, and that's all the Cardinals needed to tie it. Of course, we know that they went ahead and did more than tie it. So Stallings ends up getting called out on a low fastball in the 7th inning, the top of the 7th, and he just loses it. He goes wild and eventually gets ejected. When you see a guy as composed and really as soft-spoken as Jacob Stallings get mad enough to induce an ejection, Mike, I think you know where the emotional thermostat is for the team in the home dugout tonight.
Yeah, and Chad Kuhl, again, he pitched well. He's a guy that maybe doesn't get enough fanfare. And you look at a staff this season that has been riddled with injuries. It's been riddled with inconsistency. Game 1 had Trevor Williams start, and he only goes through 4. He allows a bunch of runs, and it ends up being another loss for him. And we also talked about on the last one of these that he was maybe a guy, of course, this staff was shaken up and everybody out of sorts because of the injuries, and nobody really was an ace. So you had Joe Musgrove having to start opening day, and then Trevor Williams, and those guys are more number 3 or 4 starters on even this Pirate team, let alone a good team. But he's one of those guys that is going to be a part of the future. They're going to give him a chance to fight out of this next year just by his youth, just by the fact that he's become a little bit of a leader for this young team in recent years. And he's honestly so popular with the fans. But he struggles in game 1. Chad Kuhl pitches really well in game 2. And you just look at the line, only 1 earned run despite the 4 runs being allowed. And that is because of the turn of events there with Jacob Stallings. And I also think it's unfortunate in a way, but also a positive in another way, because again, these games don't matter. They're not losing playoff positioning. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to be a Jim Joyce situation ruining somebody's perfect game or something important. Jerry Meals isn't going to be involved here. Nobody's going to be mad at an umpire to the point that they have to coin a phrase or add a swear word in to their name like Don F. and Dankenshire back in baseball history lore. But it still is unfortunate. Jacob Stallings doesn't want that to occur and doesn't want to lose a game that way, doesn't want to have his pitcher screwed that way, as you put it, Matt. But I think this also shows that Jacob Stallings, and this might be a surprise of the season, maybe a bright spot of the season, he's kind of emerging as, for me, the starting catcher of this team and a little bit of a leader of this team. I mean, you compare him to Murphy. They both had their appearances here in these 2 games. Neither one of them did you anything to write home about, but Jacob Stallings seems to be a guy that has command of this staff. He cares about this staff. He has a relationship with this staff. He hasn't been up here that long, but defensively, he's definitely the better catcher, and many would have thought that to be the case. He's hit well enough to stabilize that spot in the order throughout most of this season, and they may very well switch off next year because nobody really is certainly an all-star. There's no Yadier Molinas as a catcher for this team, but for me, I would give him most of the at-bats to start next year, depending on what happens in the offseason. And I think he's played into a much better positioning with this team for the future if he's able to stay around based on the situation this year. And if he can even hit a little bit like this, he can become at least a catcher that you go to maybe as your 1A, 1B. So I think that continual emergence of Jacob Stallings, again, the son of the former Pittman basketball head coach that I do enjoy, is not thrown at him more than when I bring it up. I think it's been a bright spot for this season to see his emergence as an individual player coming into his own in a season that really nobody else is coming into their own for the Pittsburgh Pirates.
I don't want to let the home plate umpire off the hook by not mentioning his name. It's Jeremy Rehak. Okay. It might be actually a minor league call-up this season. Recall that several major league umpires opted out due to COVID this year. So I didn't recognize him, so I didn't have an ability to bring his name up on memory there. Jeremy Rehak.
I don't think you need to add the F in, though, in the middle there. I don't think he needs a middle name like some of the other ones I mentioned.
No, clearly this game will not go down in the annals of either franchise. It'll be completely forgotten by the time we get to, I don't know, tomorrow morning at about 8:30 a.m., or at least that'll be the Pirates' goal for sure. I want to go to the chat here. Dave Gormley. Yeah, he's as dependable as the post office.
I think our favorite subscriber out of all of the thousands of them.
Yeah, he says, good evening. Though the 85 team was the worst I've seen in my 50 years of following the Pirates, this year's team is right up with them, if not worse. Last in most of the key offensive categories and defensive ones as well. At least the 85 team had an ace in comparison to this one. Yeah, you had DeLeon to watch that year and help make the mid-80s go down a little bit smoother as Jim Leland tried to get that ship turned around and eventually did. Yeah, a lot on the plate of Derek Shelton and Ben Sherrington to do the same here. I just saw something on Twitter, Mike. I want to run this by you because I tweeted that after another errant throw from Josh Bell.
I saw this,
Yeah, Josh Bell is not a first baseman, but the Pirates keep running him out there. I would much rather see Colin Moran out there on a day-by-day basis and have Bell be the DH. You have the DH, use it because the guy can't field. He's hurting you. Again, I know first base is the place where you hide guys, but why not use the DH in this case? Someone else tweeted at me and said that, well, maybe Sherrington's trying to, quote, showcase him as a potential first baseman and maybe hope that the teams that are scouting him aren't watching that closely because overhead throwing motion or sidearm throwing motion, it's not working out for Josh Bell, especially when it comes to just throwing the ball. I just cringe and cover my eyes, and I had a feeling it was going to be another tough situation there at second base. When he didn't go home, he went to second and threw it out into shallow left field in the 6th inning of Game 2. So do you think there's any validity to that the Pirates are playing Bell at first base because they just want to keep it in people's minds that, hey, he did get X amount of starts in a 60-game season in the field. He's not just a DH. If you're looking to trade him, I mean.
Well, that's the only devil's advocate perspective. Josh Bell is not a first baseman to the sense of the position. He cannot field the position. And as much as first basemen throughout history get a lot of flack in terms of, he's just a power hitter. He's a slugger. He's just hacking away for home runs. He doesn't care even if he strikes out occasionally. So if he doesn't really have a glove, throw him over to first base. He'll figure it out enough and then we'll go on from there. That was the situation in the National League prior to there being a universal DH this season and hopefully on to the future and probably on to the future. So that was the case prior with first basemen and maybe still was in the mind of the Pirates for Josh Bell. But I think the only reason why you would have him out there, because the better lineup, again, certainly is Colin Moran. He's been one of the better hitters for this team all year, and he actually can field first base better than Josh Bell. And Josh Bell, despite hitting a little bit more recently, has struggled this year. I said this before, that he managed to accomplish the unthinkable. He managed to accomplish actually decreasing his value despite the fact having a universal DH administered. You would assume, even before you knew about a global pandemic and COVID-19, that, oh my God, if we can get a universal DH in here, Josh Bell's value would only go up because we wouldn't have to worry about getting on the horn with any GM saying, oh no, we've been teaching him. He's going to be better at first base. Don't worry about it. Still give us all your prospects for Josh Bell because he can play first base for you if you're a National League contender. We don't have to just worry about selling him to only American League teams. You get a universal DH in there, you can call everybody and say, hey, that glove doesn't matter. He won't even bring it with you. With him, it's just going to be DH. Go ahead and bring him on to you as a contender and win a pennant. He'll hit home runs occasionally. And he's shown a little bit more pop in his bat recently. But I think there might be something in their mind as well, thinking, first off, as much as we keep saying the universal DH is probably here to stay and we want it to be here to stay, to be fair, they don't know that 100% for sure. That has not been announced. So they may have to think, okay, if the pandemic is quote unquote over next year, or at least we're in normal circumstances, Rob Manfred, who certainly is no one that anyone can gauge on what he's going to do throughout any given day. I mean, the guy is very helter-skelter in terms of his mentality. He may throw the universal DH out of there for the National League, and then all of a sudden we have to promote Josh Bell again as a first baseman, or just trade him to American League teams. And in all sense of reality, he would have more value if he could also play first base in an overall sense. I think it's a lost cause. I think you're only hurting him by having him out there. I think his value is looking worse, and it's irrelevant if you have the universal DH. But they might be thinking they're not sure about the ruling for the future, and maybe they are trying to show him at least as a serviceable first baseman, kind of crossing their fingers before these games and figuring as long as he does not commit a costly error, okay, he's fielding some grounders, we can move on. Unfortunately, though, he is decreasing his value even further because he's not able to field these grounders. He is committing costly errors, and these games don't matter. But I'm sure contenders saying, okay, we can't have him out there because when this game actually matters, he could potentially bungle it up for us. So that's the only devil's advocate perspective. It's if it's either a showcase standpoint or they're not as confident as the universal DH being a universal rule into the future as maybe we are or we're hoping is the case.
This is Pittsburgh Postgame talking Pirates. This is our third to last show of the season, so drink it in, folks. Yeah. It always goes down smooth. I'm Matt Gajtka with Mike Asti. Yeah. Pirates swept in a doubleheader for the third time this season, the 14-inning variety, not the 18-inning variety. So they have that going for them. Anyway, let's look at some ups and downs here, Mike, because well, we are contractually obligated to do so, but it also helps us break up the monotony of the show.
It's our Cal Ripken streak. We've done it every one of these. Why not?
Yeah, it's somewhere there. It's written in the stars, I'm sure.
Yes.
Okay, up. I will say this. Remember the last show that we did just a scant 48 hours ago or so, I was degrading the, quote, class of 2016 Pirates pitchers. And I know Trevor Williams, part of that class of 2016, again, had his results look less than promising. 5 more runs given up, actually 6 total, but 5 earned in that first game of the doubleheader today. His ERA remains well above 6. His WHIP remains above 1.6. I know he was upbeat in the postgame, but that's not very good. So, all right, in that case, Williams continued the downward trend of that class of pitchers. But we had Steven Brault unexpectedly, one day after I called him nothing more than a swingman at this level. I still stand by that. But, hey, everyone gets their moment in the sun, right, if you go at it long enough. And he was very aggressive in the zone. It seems like whenever Brault commits to some sort of a strategy, you'll recall he threw, I think, 80 or 90 consecutive fastballs in Denver last year, and it worked out for him too. That might have been his last win, actually, come to think of it, as a starting pitcher. But he goes the distance yesterday, and then Chad Kuhl gives up just the 1 earned run. Yes, 4 were charged to his name in the box score in 5 innings tonight, and he was battling through some sort of a blister or a cut cuticle. It was hard to tell. There was some blood. He was wiping on his jersey there. But he persevered through that and couldn't get it over the finish line. I thought maybe he might get a cheap complete game by going all 7, but still pitched well. And for the most part, more positives than negatives with him. So an up for me that we see Brault and Kuhl both step up here in the span of 24 hours.
Yeah, I think Chad Kuhl is definitely an up in the game. And I was about to say I had it written down, and I brought this up last show, and you kind of admitted that maybe some people out there are being a little too hard on the Pirates bullpen prior to the 6th inning here tonight, because then the 6th inning here tonight, the bullpen ruins things and ends up eventually imploding and losing that game. Granted, there was errors and there was a lot of controversy involved in that end of the game. But you go to game 1 again, 3 relief pitchers come in, nobody allows anything. They get a couple Ks. They mostly throw contact pitches, get ground balls, have their defense bail them out. And again, it's not an all-star bullpen, but I do believe the bullpen's been getting a little bit too much flack most of this season under the circumstances that you can't expect much more out of these guys when you're talking Howard, Rodriguez, Stratton, even though the 3 runs of game 2 here today. So I could throw a bullpen up again, to be fair to those guys. Overall, I think it was a solid 2 games for the bullpen again. Trevor Williams did not lead them much in game 1. Chad Kuhl did help them out in game 2, but I also think even though the overall numbers are not there for the bullpen, and this bullpen is one of the worst in all of baseball, to be fair to them again, not only all the injuries they dealt with the last couple of years, and even somebody sitting in prison that was supposed to be part of this bullpen, that they don't deal with starters giving them more than 4 innings most of the time. I don't have the percentages in front of me. I didn't do that research, but they're not getting starters to go deep into these games, whatever the equivalent of a respectable quality start would be for the 7 or the 9 inning games. It's very rare that's happening. It happened in game 2. It did not happen in game 1. And that makes it tougher. It certainly makes it tougher. You're facing different batters. There's more pressure on you. It's a different point in games than these pitchers are normally going to be coming in, certainly than they would be coming in if they were on a playoff team. So I think the bullpen can get some dap.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the bullpen. Turley, Hartlieb, Howard, each pitched well in that game 1, and they were one of my ups as well. So we'll knock out a second up with that, and I'll go to my third up. And really, Mike, it's about the imminent end of this season. The leaves are starting to blow around. We're seeing a few orange and red speckles on the green trees. And, well, it's a cooler night. I know that. It's going to be down into the high 30s in some areas. So It feels like the end of the season, and it is the end of the season, even though we're just 51 games in. Just 9 games left in what's been, for the most part, a death march of a 2020 season for the Pirates, if you can pardon the hyperbole. But there is one caveat there, Mike, and I suppose it's a down within and up. It's because there was a sourced report this week that said baseball is considering either combining your 2019 and 2020 records in order to fashion a cumulative record for draft order for next year, or there was a thought just to have a lottery system and look at the last 3 or 4 years. And I think it was actually the last 3 years that they were going to look at and then weight the lottery in that way. Now, if they did the combined standings, the Pirates actually would still be first just because the season has been so bad and they were near the bottom last year. But they do the lottery, then the Pirates, I think, have the 5th or the 6th best chance of winning because you'll recall they actually had a winning record in 2018. So I feel like they might go with the combined record and just roll with that because a lottery would be a big change for Major League Baseball. They've never done it before in terms of the draft. But there is that option because this is 2020 and everything is unprecedented. So I don't feel entirely secure, but I am feeling at least somewhat better that report was thrown out there, that there is a consideration to just have this season tacked on to last year and make it one big, what would that be, a 222 game sample for these teams in order to determine who picks first, second, third, etc.
Yeah, and I don't mind combining records for this and last year because as bad as the Pirates have been in it, as much of a season as this has been for teams good or bad, it's still only 60 games of a schedule. And as we've talked ad nauseum, there have been players over the years that have won MVPs that weren't an all-star through the first 60 games and then turned it around. There have been teams that were 15 plus games out after 60 games, managed to have historic comebacks and win a pennant or win a division throughout baseball history. So things could certainly change after 60 games. It's not like, say, the NHL season only had 12 games to finish, or the NBA season only had 10 or so games to finish. And yes, there were some teams that were contenders and they tried to figure things out for them. But in all reality, that probably wasn't going to change much in terms of how those seasons would have finished without a pandemic. This could have been totally different. Granted, probably not for the Pirates. They probably would have still been the worst. I don't mind combining the records going into last year because last year was very similar in terms of this year, with the exception of Mookie Betts and a few others. Most of these teams did not change catastrophically because of the pandemic offseason. I would have a problem going lottery and getting all buck wild with it, just because if you're going to do that in general, okay, other leagues have had lotteries, NBA, NHL, okay, then okay, do that in the future. But making that decision at the end of a global pandemic condensed season seems to be a bit unfair to, say, the Pirates, who have been so god-awful. And in all reality, and I'm not saying they're doing this because Derek Shelton has said he certainly would be fired if he was intentionally doing this, and he wants to be a part of the winning ways in the future. And these players want to turn it around and have some respectability within themselves. But some teams, maybe from the top, even well above Derek Shelton, could be hoping to lose, could be tanking it. And if you're doing that, and then they go to a lottery, it's all for naught. And just in my personal view of sports overall, I like having a team that plays very, very well in the regular season. We talked about this in the playoff format show a couple of nights ago, being rewarded with home field, with a better seating. I think that is fair. It should always go on throughout sports. If you have the better record, you should always play the worst team available and be rewarded with your run through the playoffs because you benefit off of success that you put forth during the regular season. Whereas the same thing works negatively. If you are the worst team, probably in all fairness, you should be like the National Football League does, and the worst team should have that first pick. It's not always been the case in leagues. There's a lot of lotteries going on, but every time there's a lottery, you have fans and media and people out there saying, well, the NHL rigged it for Crosby as a favor to Lemieux. Well, the NBA rigged it for the Knicks to get Patrick Ewing to New York to help marketing-wise in the late 80s. Well, the NBA rigged it for Cleveland to get them LeBron James, the Northeast Ohio boy, and help them break their drought that he eventually did after leaving and coming back. And then you think about it, some of those conspiracy theories might have some legs. So, okay, just give it to the worst team. In all reality, most of the time it's the same team, but maybe not always. But I would rather it go to the worst team to get that number one overall pick and just have it be that way. If teams want to tank and that's the best recipe for them as small markets, go ahead. Whoever tanks the best gets that pick. If teams don't want to tank, that's up to them. But whoever's that worst team should get it. And certainly, regardless of that argument, it should not be changed to that catastrophic of a difference in the draft now in the midst of a global pandemic. But we've seen crazier things. I mean, I don't know if all Pirate fans realize, I was talking to you off air about you have your hat backwards, and I always wore my hat backwards growing up. And then I went to buy my first Oakland A's. I got you there. I went to buy my first fitted hat, and my mom told me, well, you got to have your fitted hat. You realize now you got to have that front ways. And I said, no, I don't. I can wear it backwards as a fitted hat. Ken Griffey Jr. is a Hall of Famer. He's a legend, and he had his hat backwards. Well, if they were just doing it by worst team and they didn't care about leagues or switching off for lotteries or any of those rules, Ken Griffey Jr. might have been a Pittsburgh Pirate. And I could have been saying that living in Pittsburgh and being a Griffey fan growing up with him actually a part of my home team. And to think of the early 90s could have been an outfield with Barry Bonds and Ken Griffey Jr. if they would have just done it off of worst overall record. That would have been the case. The Pirates would have then been able to draft Griffey. Not the case because that's not how they did it then. But that's how I would rather it go. But you can't change it that catastrophic now. Granted, I guess you can do whatever you want to do if you're Rob Manfred, but I don't recommend it.
Let's talk some downs here on Pittsburgh Postgame. I want to talk hidden errors, Mike, as if there weren't enough for the Pirates in the sixth inning. But Brian Hayes was charged with a throwing error on a fielder's choice at the plate. I know I lauded Jacob Stallings just a moment ago at the top of the show, but he and Ke'Bryan weren't on the same page there with that because Ke'Bryan saw that Paul Goldschmidt of the Cardinals, was running inside the baseline. So I think he intentionally threw that, made the adjustment and threw it to the outside of the baseline, and Stallings just wasn't ready for that. And one of those errors that, you could give it to Hayes or you could also give it to Stallings. Of course, that's just not what happens in official scoring. They always give it to the guy who threw it, not to the catcher in that spot. But I put some of that blame on Stallings. Also, the fact that inning was allowed to progress on from the game-tying sacrifice fly that made it 2-2. Gregory Polanco, I don't know if he slipped. I think Greg Brown alluded to the thought that he may have slipped on the throw home, but he shouldn't be throwing home there. It was a high throw. And then you see him kind of go like this. And he couldn't get that throw to third base, which would have kept the runner Goldschmidt from moving up and eventually scoring the go-ahead run on the throwing error. So one of those butterfly effect type of innings. If this happened, then that happened. And if this didn't happen, then would the rest of it have happened? It's hard to say, right? Catcher's interference, questionable walk, 4-pitch walk after that. So there was a lot that maybe one of those events goes the other way. The Pirates are at least in a tie game going into the seventh, but it's just some hidden errors in there. Polanco didn't get an error for the throw, but he very well could have because it was just as impactful as anything in there. So maybe mental errors are in there as well as physical for the Pirates. You could arguably say there were 5 errors in total in the field. in that 6th inning. So I dare you to top that one. 5 errors in an inning for a down here tonight.
Yeah. And that was one of the worst innings the Pirates have had this season in terms of luck. And that's saying something because this has been a very unlucky season for the Pittsburgh Pirates, as we had a chatter bring up, our favorite subscriber there, how this maybe is the worst Pirate team in the history of the franchise. And there's been a lot of bad teams, despite it also being a successful franchise in many regard. And I actually had Jerry DiPaolo, who's covered many of these Pirate teams as well with the Trib, a former colleague of mine there, on a previous post-game show, talk about that the 85 team, people compare that to this team a lot. The 85 team, and I've heard this from others, John Parada said the same thing, and he's also covered many Pirate teams over the years and covered that 85 team, that the 85 team admittedly didn't care, that while he was interviewing those players during that season, they were not really trying to win. They weren't tanking for the betterment of the future of the franchise. They just didn't like the franchise. They were veterans. They wanted the hell out of there. It was right before things got really turned around with Van Slank and Benet and company, and they were admittedly not really carrying. So that was a team that didn't care, as a bunch of pesky veterans, most of which would then leave. And then you get into a winning tradition with those young players. Whereas this is a team that has mostly young players. You were trying to figure out who's a part of the future, and you come to realize that maybe none of them are. So this team maybe hurts more and maybe gets credit for being worse, because this is a team that should have cared more and ends up actually playing worse than a team they're historically compared to that admittedly didn't care, regardless of how the final records shake out. Before we round things out, though, Matt, I do have an interesting question for you. I want to get your take on this, because we've talked a lot about how this season has been disappointing, and how this season, maybe not disappointing, it was kind of expected to be poor, and it's been worse than that. And all these different players that have had slumps and have, for lack of a better term, just sucked, and they've decreased their value. What your Polanco segment kind of brought this to my memory, because I could argue maybe it's him. But which individual Pirate this year do you think has had 2020 stain them the most individually? If you get what I'm asking. Maybe it could be Josh Bell as well. Which Pirate's value is at its lowest thanks to their 2020 performance or lack thereof?
Well, the scariest performance for me is Gregory Polanco, because even though it is a 60-game sample, actually just a 50-game sample
for him
as of right now, give or take, his swing and miss rate is frightening. And if you're looking to move him, if you're hoping to get something out of him next year, he's still under contract, and then 2 more team option years after that. If you're looking to get something out of him, though, you don't like the way that his bat is trending. And part of it might be just the fact that he's had limited action over the past 2 or 3 years due to injuries. But I don't get that at all. I don't understand how he's swinging and missing so much. I believe he has a 40% plus strikeout rate still at this point, or at least he did going into the series here against the Cardinals. So I'd say Polanco, because I've still had some thoughts that he could be that well-rounded all-around guy, and maybe not be an absolute superstar, but be a star, be a guy who could give you fringy all-star production. We saw it in 2018 before he got hurt, which I've brought up many times. But this season just makes me very discouraged about his future. I think we knew what Josh Bell was, a streaky guy, a guy who can give you a lot of pop, a guy who can't really field necessarily, but someone who could carry the team if he gets hot, and certainly an average bat, I would say, on the aggregate. But Polanco, it's amazing. He was called up in 2014, and he's still considered somewhat of an unknown, an enigma in that way, just because we've seen such wildly variant performances from him from season to season. And you mix in all the various injuries, especially to that throwing shoulder, which is supposed to be one of his greatest assets too. So I would go Polanco on that.
And you look at contract and you look at age, regardless of what Ben Cherington wants to say, he is an older member of this team and he's been around longer. You have more tape on him. You maybe could give him some flack opening up the year because of the injury plague season ago and then the COVID-19 diagnosis. But I think any slack you were cutting him is well gone at this point. 50 games in, yes, it's a short sample size, but Brian Reynolds, who has started to perform a little bit better recently and did hit relatively okay with a couple singles here in this doubleheader in these games, and Josh Bell a little bit more recently than in the past, as well as some others, that is not so much that he's not hitting and his batting average is all around 100 most of the season around the Mendoza line. It's the fact that, as you mentioned, he's not making contact. He's flowing away out there. it's almost to the effect of you can get some guys off the street and they can put together similar games. And I'm not to say that it's easy to hit 100 even in Major League Baseball for an average Joe, but you get what I'm saying. He's really been almost embarrassing himself out there in terms of what you would figure to be him as a major leaguer. And you also would hope that maybe a player like him, even if it's the end of his line, could maybe be a leader and say, okay, I'm going to still pick it up here. I'm going to still play well. I'm going to try to show something in of himself to showcase himself, because he maybe had the most on the line coming into the season with his age again, his contract situation, and whether or not he'd be part of the future of this team. And again, he's done nothing but decrease his value. Granted, contractually, they might be stuck with him.
Let's get a couple more downs in before we go. I want to talk about catcher's interference. There were 2 catcher's interference calls in the doubleheader today, which I don't know if we're seeing more of it this season from the Pirates. I don't know if catchers are setting up closer to the plate, or hitters setting up further back in the batter's box. It's an odd call, Mike, technically an error in the books. And for me, it's always a confusing moment, because you can't really tell as a fan watching from the center field camera what in the world is going on for that split second. I thought the Pirates had struck out Goldschmidt there in the 6th inning. Then I thought, well, is it a foul tip? I heard something. And then I realized finally it's catcher's interference. So it's one of those moments in baseball where I wish there was a more definitive sign the umpire could give. Because if you're watching that game live, you probably have no idea what happens even after the guy goes down to first base. Right. So one of my few complaints about baseball, and I'd like to modernize the sport. I want to bring it up to date. Maybe some of my ideas are more radical than others. I wouldn't mind 7-inning games all the time to speed things up. I wouldn't mind a lot of drastic measures. Pitch clocks, definitely bring those in, shortening the season, et cetera, et cetera. Catcher's interference is one of those that's really odd to me. And a lot of times, is it really the catcher's fault? I don't know, but it's just a very unsatisfying viewing experience there, and confusing at times, I would say. I don't know how you feel about it.
Yeah, it certainly is hard to watch that as a fan, and I would like certain things to be modernized. I do think actually the benefit of this pandemic season for Major League Baseball, and maybe for a lot of companies in our world, with a lot of companies getting better online and beefing up their websites and having a lot of employees be able to work from home a lot more than in the past, and not dumping a tons of money into offices and doing a lot more work from home. I mean, I had a studio here for Pittsburgh Sports Live. The pandemic kind of came along. We realized that really wasn't necessary. We're doing a lot of this from our home studios, and it's moving along the channel just the same. So that's a positive in a way of this overall year pandemic wise. And maybe it forces Major League Baseball to modernize themselves, some ruling, meaning the universal DH. Honestly, the universal DH would never be, eventually it might have been, but it certainly has been sped up in terms of being a part of Major League Baseball because of the pandemic. The pandemic was an excuse for the National League to throw it in there, and even the people that would hate it would have to deal with it because they realize there's a global pandemic going on and they want to get done with this season as quick as possible. So they were able to get the universal DH in there because of the pandemic. That certainly helped things. The 7-inning games are aided because of the pandemic. Without a pandemic, you're probably not seeing this. For me, I'm not as radical as you that I'm down with 7-inning games in a doubleheader all the time. That's fine. I don't want to administer them throughout every game throughout all of baseball. You're taking at bats away, and maybe part of me just doesn't, as an historian, doesn't want to see Mike Trout lose at bats constantly after losing a season like this. But I don't want to go that much of a change. However, I certainly will be fine with it during a doubleheader, and I wouldn't have thought that a season ago. So a pandemic allows us to see that example this year and be maybe improved because of it. Same thing with the universal DH, same thing with maybe a clock. I think those things are all aided because of the pandemic shortened season. They're allowed to get in there because of this year, and maybe could be part of the future, and probably wouldn't have been if it wasn't to rush them in because of this season. But baseball does have an issue in terms of watchability, and that certainly doesn't help it. I mean, catcher interference and things like that don't help it. There's even times where you feel like replay, while you want to get calls right, feels like sometimes replay goes overboard in terms of watchability. But you're probably not going to go backwards there. So we'll see. But I think you hate to say a global pandemic has created some positives, but in terms of the business world, in terms of sports, in terms of rules, in terms of certain leagues modernizing themselves that used to just live in the past, it maybe did force them along that otherwise they wouldn't have been there. They got a nudge in some respects. So maybe that can be a rare plus from the pandemic season for the future of baseball.
Well, I think the universal DH was coming in regardless, like you say, but I think it was probably maybe a year or possibly 2 or 3
You're
down
able
the
to
line,
rush
or
it
it could have
along.
come in with the
Right.
new CBA negotiations.
Sure.
Actually, the universal DH, I'm not even really sure what that has to do with a pandemic season or a shortened season. I don't know why that was thrown in, but I'm glad it was, because I was sick and tired of watching pitchers hit and having a wasted at bat a couple of times a game. That didn't make much sense. All right, one more down, and I'll tie this into what's coming up, because tomorrow, 7 o'clock Saturday, we'll have Mitch Keller back on the mound for the Pirates, his second start since his return from that side injury that cost him most of this season. Then we'll see Joe Musgrove on Sunday for the 4 p.m. series capper. Not as excited about Musgrove. I feel like we know what we have in Joe Musgrove.
Pretty clear.
I feel like we know what we have in, honestly, Trevor Williams, too. So my down is that I wish we had more prospects coming up from the farm that we could all watch together and see what they can do in a couple of audition starts. As we have it right now, it's Keller a couple more times, and it's JT Brubaker a couple more times. Maybe his upside's a little more limited than you might like, but at least we do have that in terms of reasons to watch, right? Because it's tough to find them right now, and everyone out there realizes this. I've told you before, ratings are down this season in general. I can't imagine they're going up for the final 2 weeks of the season. So I just wish maybe there was one more prospect the Pirates could bring up that we could all feast our eyes on and watch him for a few innings here for a couple of starts late in the season, and perhaps just give a guy like Trevor Williams the rest of the season off. I don't know what he's accomplishing by going out there. I realize easy for me to say I'm not him. He's working on stuff, as he clearly said in the post-game press conference today. But as far as looking into the future, I don't know what seeing Trevor a couple more times this year really does for me.
I do think, though, to be fair to those pitchers, Trevor Williams in particular, who you bring up, that said he's working on stuff, while they're not throwing out gems of starts, and while you're still seeing starts in which they barely get out of the fourth, admittedly, at the end of this season, probably for at least a month now, they are almost treating their starts now like spring training starts. So they are working on things. They are working on mechanics. You actually occasionally see these pitchers throw pitches they didn't previously throw, and they're just trying new pitches. So when you're doing that, like in spring training, which you'll see, you're going to have worse outcomes than maybe you normally would have. So I don't know if it's fair to gauge the last month or so from Trevor Williams in particular as who he is in general, but certainly not an ace, certainly not a number 1 or a 2. He's maybe a serviceable 3 or 4. Same thing with Musgrove at the upside. But I do think that if you can't hammer too much home the stats for them in recent starts, because they might admittedly be working on things. And it's very possible their pitching coach and Derek Shelton told them, we are not going to look at the ERA from August and September at all, because we know this is basically spring training baseball to you. I'm not going to leave you out there to dry and have an ERA of 10 in a game if you're really getting shellacked. But outside of that, you're going to get 4 or 5 innings like they've been getting, even when they're not getting it done, and go ahead and try to work on a new pitch. If you give up a home run, that's okay. So that could be the directive. I don't know that. It appears that's kind of what he's doing, even if it's not the directive. So if they're treating it like spring training, I guess we have to evaluate them fairly as if it is spring training and not hold them too much to the fire of their numbers. But who knows? I do think, in the sense, though, that the ratings, they were briefly helped by Ke'Bryan Hayes. He came up that day. He had the major debut. That was a day the Penguins were done. Football season hadn't started yet. It was early in the week. There wasn't much going on. Even the Hounds played later on in that weekend. So the Pittsburgh sports world, you look at Twitter that day, that Tuesday, they were talking about Ke'Bryan Hayes. The Pirates did own the day in Pittsburgh sports, despite being well out of the race. And a couple days thereafter, and maybe that's why the Pirate fans are watching. I did post this on Twitter and didn't really get a legit answer. But if you're not hosting post-game shows like us or covering this team on a beat, if you're just a fan, what are you watching right now unless it is just for Ke'Bryan Hayes? That's pretty much all you have to watch for. So it'd be nice to have a pitcher in that same respect, but at least they do have Ke'Bryan Hayes to watch for. But in all reality, are they really watching? That's not even our focus any longer here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, as we have a slate of post-game shows with Pitt, with West Virginia, with the Steelers coming up when all those teams play throughout weekends. Those teams mostly own the weekends now for the channel more than the Pirates, as we've kind of abandoned the Saturday and Sunday Pirate programming, even the Riverhounds being a winning team right now and looking at their postseason. So they're owning the channel more than the Pirates right now. So to be fair, in all reality, the season is pretty much over. Matt and I have held true to the commitment of finishing this one out, and you're probably going to see our faces a lot here, the final 3 for the Pirates, but I can't expect anyone to watch. Whether it be these post-game shows, which they are watching, so we do appreciate that for the numbers, but I can't expect anyone to watch these Pirate games for any reason outside of Ke'Bryan Hayes.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying we should evaluate Williams harshly or
Right.
Chad Kuhl harshly. I'm just saying I'd like to see more from the farm if that was possible, but apparently it isn't with all the injuries and with the fact that guys just aren't ready apparently to come up and show their stuff. And I apologize. It's only one more start for Williams, one more for Stephen Brault too. I know he's coming off a complete game, but we also know what we have in Stephen Brault as well. So not that these guys are factored out for next season or anything close to that. But it just feels like there could be more opportunities for auditions. That would interest me as a guy who's interested in what the Pirates are going to do in the future. So that's all I'm saying there for the final down of today's Pittsburgh postgame. Again, like I said, Cardinals, 7 p.m. Saturday, Mitch Keller back on the mound, 4 p.m. Sunday, right after the Steelers game. That'll be during our Pittsburgh postgame. You and I, Mike,
we're going to be focusing on the Steelers.
Yeah, we'll be talking Steelers and Bronx at, approximately whenever that game wraps up, 4:15, 4:30, somewhere in that range. You mentioned college football. We have that this weekend. Just one college football show, correct?
Yeah, the Mountaineers are off. WVU has a rare bye week because they lost the Maryland game with the scheduling and the pandemic. So they don't play. And I actually will be with Mike Vakovican. So normally I anchor the West Virginia post-game shows and he handles things for Pitt. But because West Virginia being off, we're going to come at it together, and I'm going to put my Pitt hat on and jump over to PSN, the mothership, and I am going to host with Mike Vakovican, our leader there, our fearless leader, and the guy running things at Pittsburgh Sports Now. So we're only going to have the one Pitt postgame show, the one college football postgame show. West Virginia is off this weekend, and then, of course, the Steelers on Sunday. And get back there in the chat. I was very pleasantly not surprised, but pleasantly pleased, I guess, with the debut of that post-game show for Steelers Now. So that's a site that's near to my heart and that I help run. So I'm happy to have you again for the Steelers one. And that's going to be a more reasonable hour there around 4:15, 4:30, unless things get really crazy, midday Sunday. So that would kind of close out the weekend. And then we'll be at it again. We have a few more of these. We are going to get these in, maybe one per series, probably just Matt and I. Probably done trying to get any guests here or colleagues or friends of mine to be a part of this. I think if I'm going to bring them on the channel, it'll probably be for something else, but we'll probably putter away here. As the team putters away to end their season, we will putter away here on Pittsburgh Sports Live and get this thing wrapped up. But we do have a lot going on here, of course, on the channel. And of course, I say this on everything I'm on, which is a lot on Pittsburgh Sports Live, that below, down there, there's a button. You click subscribe. It's free to do so. If you don't want to follow us on Twitter, if you don't want to look at any of the sites, but you don't mind this commentary, you like being in the chat, hit that up. It'll give you a notification when anything goes up, any of the sites, anything at all, live, otherwise, you'll immediately get a notification. So it makes it easier for us to get the content to you.
Well, thank you for watching. Thank you, Mike, for the rundown there. And we'll have a Pirates postgame during the Cubs series, which runs Monday through Thursday. It's a 4-gamer at PNC Park to wrap up the home schedule. And they'll be at Cleveland that final weekend. We'll find a day there, too. So we'll still have some Bucko talk, like Mike said, but busy weekend coming up. I'll also have a special Riverhounds Pittsburgh postgame on the road tomorrow at Loudoun United in Leesburg, Virginia. I'm making the trip for some rare road coverage for Pittsburgh Soccer Now. John Krasinski's site, part of our family of sites here. And I will have a video report, maybe even throw in some post-game press conference activities with head coach Bob Lilly and a chosen player as the Hounds try to win for the fifth consecutive time and almost essentially put away the group first place finish. And that would be a home playoff game, at least to start, if not many, many more, if they're able to advance. All right, that's it for us on Pittsburgh Postgame. Thank you for watching. We'll talk to you coming up here this weekend. You'll see our faces many times. See you then.